Instead of one black America, now there are four. A mainstream middle-class majority with a full ownership stake in American society. A large abandoned minority with less hope of escaping poverty and dysfunction than at any time since Reconstruction's crushing end. A small transcendent elite with such enormous wealth, power, and influence that even white folks have to genuflect. Two newly emergent groups, individuals of mixed race heritage and communities of recent black immigrants that make us wonder what black is even supposed to mean. These four black Americas are increasingly distinct, separated by demography, geography, and psychology. They have different profiles, different mindsets, different hopes, fears, and dreams. There are times and places where we all still come back together, on the increasingly rare occasions when we feel lumped together, defined, and threatened solely on the basis of skin color, usually involving some high-profile instance of bald-faced discrimination or injustice, and in venues like urban or black-oriented radio, which serves as a kind of speed-of-light grapevine. More and more, however, we lead separate lives. And where these distinct nations rub against one another, there are sparks. The mainstream tend to doubt the authenticity of the emergent, but they are usually too polite or too politically correct to say so out loud. The abandoned accuse the emergent, the immigrant segment at least, of moving into abandoned neighborhoods and using the locals as mere stepping stones. The immigrant emergent, with their intact families and long-range mindset, ridicule the abandoned for being their own worst enemies. The mainstream bemoan the plight of the abandoned, but express their deep concern from a distance. The transcendent, to steal the old line about Boston society, speak only to God. They are idolized by the mainstream and the emergent for the obstacles they have overcome, and by the abandoned for the shiny things they own. Mainstream, emergent, and transcendent all lock their car doors when they drive through an abandoned neighborhood. They think the abandoned don't hear the disrespectful thunk of the locks. They're wrong. How did this breakup happen? It's overly simplistic to draw a straight line from "we shall overcome" to "get rich or die trying," but that's the general trajectory. 40 years ago, after major cities from coast to coast had gone up in flames, black equaled poor. Roughly 6 in 10 black Americans were barely a step ahead of the bill collector, with fully 40% of the total living in the abject penury that the Census Bureau officially labels poverty, and another 20% earning a bit more but still basically poor. Over the next 3 decades, as civil rights laws banned discrimination in education, housing, and employment, and as affirmative action offered life-changing opportunities to those prepared to take advantage, millions of black households clawed their way into the mainstream, and the black poverty rate fell steadily, year after year. By the mid-90s, it was down to 25%, and then the needle got stuck. Today, roughly 1/4 of black Americans, the abandoned, remain in poverty. And the poorest of these poor folks are actually losing ground. In 2000, 14.9% of black households reported income of less than $10,000 in today's dollars. In 2005, the figure was 17.1%. Demographically, the abandoned constitute the youngest black America. They are also by far the least suburban, living for the most part in core urban neighborhoods and the rural South. Those who made it into the mainstream, however, have continued their rise. In 1967, only 1 black household in 10 made $50,000 a year. Now, 3 of every 10 black families earn at least that much. More strikingly, 4 decades ago, not even 2 black households in 100 earned the equivalent of more than $100,000 a year. Now, almost 1 black household in 10 has crossed that threshold to the upper middle class, joining George and Louise Jefferson in that deluxe apartment in the sky, perhaps, or living down the street from the Huxtables' handsomely appointed brownstone. All told, the 4 black Americas control an estimated $800 billion in purchasing power, roughly the GDP of the 13th richest nation on earth. Most of that money is made and spent by the mainstream. Here's another way to look at it. 40 years ago, if you found yourself among a representative all-black crowd, you could assume that nearly half the people around you were poor, poorly educated, and underemployed. Today, if you found yourself at a representative gathering of black adults, 4 out of 5 would be solidly middle class. And some African Americans have soared far higher. A friend of mine who lives in Chicago once took a flight on the Tribune Company's corporate jet. Noticing a much larger, newer, fancier private jet parked on the tarmac nearby, he asked his boss whose it was. The answer: Oprah's. The all-powerful Winfrey is one of the African Americans who have soared highest of all into the realm of the transcendent. There have long been black millionaires. Madam C.J. Walker, who built an empire on hair care products in the early 20th century, is often cited as the first. But never before have African Americans presided as full-fledged masters of the universe over some of the biggest firms on Wall Street: Richard Parsons, Kenneth Chenault, Stanley O'Neill. There have been wealthy black athletes since Jack Johnson, but never before have they transformed themselves into such savvy tycoons: Michael Jordan, Tiger Woods. And while African Americans have made billions for the music industry over the years, even pioneers such as Berry Gordy Jr. and Quincy Jones never owned and controlled as big a chunk of the business as today's hip-hop moguls, Russell Simmons, P. Diddy, Jay-Z. And the emergent? They're the product of two separate phenomena. First, there has been a flood of black immigrants from Africa and the Caribbean. In 1980, the census reported 816,000 foreign-born black people in the United States. By the 2000 census, that figure had more than tripled to 2,815,000. You might question my use of the word flood for numbers that seem relatively small in absolute terms, but consider these newcomers' outsized impact. Half or more of the black students entering elite universities such as Harvard, Princeton, and Duke these days are the sons and daughters of African immigrants. This makes sense when you consider that their parents are the best educated immigrant group in America, with more advanced degrees than the Asians, the Europeans, you name it. They are far better educated than native-born Americans, black or white. But their children's educational success leads mainstream and abandoned black Americans to ask whether affirmative action and other programs designed to foster diversity are reaching the people they were intended to help: the systematically disadvantaged descendants of slaves. The second emergent phenomenon is the acceptance of interracial marriage, once a crime and until recently a novelty. A University of Michigan study found that in 1990, nearly 1 married black man in 10 was wed to a white woman, and roughly 1 married black woman in 25 was wed to a white man. These figures, the researchers found, had increased 8-fold over the previous 4 decades. Barack Obama, the man who would be president, Adrian Fenty, the mayor of Washington, D.C., Jordan Sparks, a winner on American Idol, all are the product of black-white marriages. And the Boomer Echo generation, raised on a diet of diversity, has even fewer hang-ups about race and relationships. In a sense, though, we're just headed back to the future. Harvard scholar Henry Louis Gates, Jr. recently produced a public television series in which he used genealogical research and DNA testing to unearth the heritage of several prominent African Americans. When he sent his own blood off to be tested, Gates discovered to his surprise that more than 50% of his genetic material was European. Wider DNA testing has shown that nearly 1/3 of all African Americans trace their heritage to a white male ancestor, likely a slave owner. So forget about whether the mixed race emergents are black enough. How black am I? How black can any of us claim to be?